Let me welcome all speakers and attendees who joined our session today on behalf of the Kazakhstan PhD Association in the UK and all our organizing team. So I'm going to moderate the session today. My name is Madina Junussova. I'm representing ambassador in Canada at this association, and also leading the urban team. And I'm working as the Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Public Policy and Administration at the University of Central Asia. And I'm happy that we had a chance today to discuss this interesting topic of the impact of COVID-19 to cities and local communities. And I highly appreciate our speakers who agreed to share their experience from their countries. And we're going today to discuss experience of Ukraine and UK. And also tomorrow we continue by focusing on the health issues. And there will be speakers from Almaty and Bishkek administration, as well as experts from different fields. So tomorrow will be more like a panel discussion. Today we are going to have several presentations, and then we will be open for questions and discussion. So before I start, I would like to thank our team who actually prepared this seminar. I'm not going to list all of them, just want to thank Aldiyar Isenov, Kanat Nurkin, Sania Soltovaeva, and all other guys who helped to arrange this seminar and gather the topic. Also, our friend from Ukraine, Roman, who actually linked us with our Ukrainian colleagues. So according to the agenda, we had to start from the UK presentation and the UK experience, but I would like to give a floor to our Ukrainian colleagues who are going to talk about interesting experience they have because they actually taking part in this interesting endeavor of decentralization in the post-Soviet country. And we have here Dr. Pavla Ostapchenko and Dr. Anatoly Melnichuk. They together actually took part in decentralization reforms in Ukraine, and they're both researchers, and that's why they took a very evidence-based approach. So they not only planned something, but they also did some very important community research to understand the situation and then propose some solutions. So Pablo, you would like to share your screen, yeah? Okay, so then the floor is yours. By the way, we are going to switch to Russian now. And I just want to remind you that this event is simultaneously translated into 3 languages. So it's if you want to choose the English, you should go to the button on the bottom right, interpretation, and then choose the English language. Also, you can choose Kazakh language, but unfortunately, because of the technical issues, you have an option of Korean language. So if you want to hear the Russian or Kazakh, you have to push the Korean, or you have to choose the Korean language. Құрметті қатысушылар, егер сіздер қазақша тыңдағыңыз келсе, бүгін енді техникалық бір жағдай болып қалып, қазақ тілінің орнына кореян тілі процесс бар. Сейчас я, Павла, извините, не договорила. Соны таңдаңыздар, Korean language дегенді таңдаңыздар. Сейчас Павла перейдет на русский язык, поэтому все, please switch to the English option, all those who wants to listen in English, because Paula is going to speak in Russian. Thank you. So, Paula, the floor is yours.
Перейдем к вызовам и то, как переносят наши города, наши объединенные территориальные общины вызов по пандемии. И об этом более детально расскажет Анатолий. Он тоже, как и я, эксперт в территориальной организации власти. И мы оба географы, кандидаты географических наук. Я фактически ученик Анатолия, можно так сказать. Мне это очень как бы приятно, что мы делаем этот доклад вместе. Ну, чтобы не забирать время и прийти как бы к нашим исследованиям, к нашей реформе, я начну со слайда, какие же были основные причины начала реформы в 2015 году по изменениям функциональных возможностей территориальных громад, по изменению административно-территориального устройства Украины и что этому привело. Ну, в общем, мы как бы выделяем 4 основных принципа, которые были как бы не соответствовали Европейской хартии местного самоуправления, и как бы по нашему мнению нужно было что-то как бы изменять и применять новые подходы. Ну, в общем, как бы у нас такой бэкграунд, что наша страна 24 года жила после получения независимости по старой системе, как местного самоуправления, так и административно-территориального устройства. И ну, это как бы не очень позитивно сказывалось в целом на развитии страны, городов, общин. И у нас было несколько как бы попыток до 2015 года в стране начать реформу. Это 2007 год, 2010, но все как бы только было на словах, и реальные изменения начались в 2015 году, когда как бы после революции достоинства у нас как бы поменялся вектор внутренний, внешнеполитический, и как бы начались изменения. Ну, как бы, какие принципы были нарушены в основе? Это принцип признания местным самоуправлением компетенции собственной. То есть у нас было сложное иерархическое, неупорядкованная, четырехступеневая этапная структура админустройства, и это как бы усложняло тоже управление общинами. И в состав, ну, как пример могу назвать, что в состав некоторых общин, например, это в большей мере городских, могли входить сельские, другие городские общины и тоже поселковые общины. То есть один орган местного самоуправления мог как бы быть в подчинении другого органа. И ну, это, конечно, вызывало там, не соответствовало Европейской хартии и вызывало множество проблем на местах. Второй как бы принцип, это нарушен принцип повсеместности юрисдикции местного самоуправления, и как бы до 2015 года по законам Украины как бы компетенция местных органов власти была как бы распространялась только на территорию населенных пунктов. Сейчас же это изменено, и вся территория общины с прилегающими там сельскими местностями, с ресурсами, все, практически уже все передано местным общинам, и это как бы позволяет, дает такое движение к развитию. Также у нас не было в законодательстве предусмотрено право на объединение и сотрудничество местных общин. В результате общины имели много много мало ресурсов, но много полномочий, и они банально не могли как бы на той ресурсной финансовой базе реализовать эти полномочия. И ну, это как бы фактически тоже нарушало принцип спроможности, как бы, сейчас найду соответствие на русский, как capability, то есть возможностей, да, местных общин развиваться без там прямого вмешательства государства. Ну, что у нас как бы получилось? До 2020 года, вот мы видим на слайде, у нас было 490 районов, практически 12 тысяч местных общин, городских, поселковых и сельских. И в 2021 году у нас количество как районов, так и поселковых, и городских и сельских общин практически в 8 раз уменьшилось. И сейчас составляет около 1500 территориальных громад. Ну, у нас они называются территориальные громады. На русском это, ну, как бы соответствие территориальной общины. Вот такой вот переход. И какая еще особенность была вот, на протяжении 2015-2020 года по трансформации местного самоуправления, по децентрализации полномочий, то, что нашим законодательством было предусмотрено добровольное объединение общин. И на промежутке с 15 по 20 год, вот мы видим на этом слайде, было объединено 1070 общин добровольно. То есть люди как бы там был принят в 2015 году, даже в 2014 году вступил в силу в 2015 закон об добровольном объединении, и территориальные общины как бы сами выбирали, как им объединяться, в какой конфигурации. Это закон как бы описывал всю эту процедуру. Ну и вот, если мы видим как бы на карте, то процесс был, ну, в каких-то областях более активно проходил, в каких-то менее, но как бы такая дисперсность прослеживается, то есть таких четких закономерностей фактически нету. То есть общины как на востоке, так и на западе, и севере, и юге активно объединялись. Но как в каждой реформе децентрализации после добровольного этапа идет этап административный. Каждая страна этот этап проходит по-разному. Ну, как бы у нас получилось через 5 лет, фактически даже через 4,5 года перейти с добровольного на административный этап. Этому этапу как бы передавал ну вот что получилось, да, то есть после того, как, я верну на слайд назад, после того, как у нас состоялось как бы укрупнение вот этих синеньких, желтеньких, зеленых пятнышек, территориальной общины. У нас оставалось еще значительное количество территорий, терробщин, которые ну, не хотели объединяться. И ну, вот, пришлось как бы административным методом это все сделать. И вот такая вот трансформация произошла с 11 250 общин. Это те, которые сейчас как бы на подконтрольной территории Украины находятся, перешли, трансформировались в 1469 территориальных общин. И, ну, как бы, для чего это было сделано? Чтобы более спроможным терробщинам, территориальным общинам передать больше полномочий как и финансовых ресурсов. То есть практически уровень районный, на котором у нас тоже есть местное управление.
Павла, у вас 5 минут.
Да, я понял. Они как бы было немножко упрощено, и из-за этого районный как бы уровень тоже был немножко упрощен. Ну, я думаю, если как бы более детально можно будет еще в следующих там, наших встречах рассказать, а сейчас Анатолий расскажет об тех вызовах, с которыми столкнулись общины фактически на первом же своем годе существования, но с большими ресурсами и большими полномочиями. Анатолий, я передаю вам слово. Спасибо.
Здравствуйте. Моя задача ознакомить очень коротко с результатами опроса, который мы провели в Всеукраинской ассоциации ОТГ в рамках проекта поддержки децентрализации в Украине программой СКЛ. Опрос был проведен в декабре 2020 года. В опросе приняли участие 74 территориальные громады из 21 региона. И он касался такого вопроса, как влияет меры по предотвращению распространения коронавируса COVID-19 на развитие на местную экономику. Следующий слайд, пожалуйста. Павел, переключи слайд, пожалуйста. Один из вопросов – это как была налажена коммуникация между центральными органами управления и местными органами управлениями. Мы получили такой ответ, что 40% тех, кто дал ответ, считают, что коммуникации никакой не было, 55% считают, что они были хорошо осведомлены, и только 5% считают, что они были услышаны и могли отстоять свою позицию в контексте этих предлагаемых правительством мер по поддержке местной экономики, которые коснулись территориальных громад и их бюджетов. Следующий слайд, пожалуйста. Как воспринимались лидерами территориальных громад те меры, которые предприняло правительство? Мы видим, что очень конструктивно большинство, 67%, считают, что эти меры были нужны, и они связаны с тем, что экономика подчинена сохранению жизни и здоровья граждан. Еще 22% считали, что эти меры помогут противодействовать распространению коронавируса. Следующий слайд, пожалуйста. Следующий вопрос – это какие же потери понесли бюджеты наших громад в связи с тем, что были упразднены некоторые налоги. В первую очередь такие важные местные налоги, как налог на землю, рента на использование земли и налог на недвижимость. Мы видим, что в среднем одна громада теряла около 1 миллиона гривен, это что-то около 23 тысяч фунтов стерлингов за месяц, и это составляло приблизительно 30% тех налогов, которые они могли бы собрать, если бы не было этих мероприятий. Следующий слайд, пожалуйста. На этом слайде говорится о том, что местные советы не ждали мероприятий от центрального органа управления, и они, конечно же, несли потери из бюджета, денег и до этого, закупая индивидуальные средства защиты, медикаменты и многое другое. И мы поделили на 3 группы наши опрошенные громады, которые мы опросили, получили, что они теряли около разной группы от 45 тысяч до миллиона гривен за 1 месяц на подготовку или противодействие пандемии коронавируса, которая же происходила. Следующий слайд, пожалуйста. На этом слайде мы видим, какие мероприятия правительства были поддержаны и какие не были поддержаны. Конечно же, не были поддержаны такие, как скасування, как отказ от платы за землю и аренды за землю. Это 29 и 21% только поддержали. Конечно же, эти меры принесли самые большие убытки для местных бюджетов. И большую поддержку нашли это отказ от платы за недвижимость и некоторые другие налоги. Мы еще спросили также о тех мерах, которые не были в Украине задействованы, но были задействованы в Европе. Как бы они поддержали, скажем, снижение налога на добавленную стоимость крупных промышленных предприятий, снижение акциза, и эти меры тоже были в основном поддержаны, были бы поддержаны местными властями. Следующий слайд, пожалуйста. Очень важный слайд, который показывает, как лидеры наших общин воспринимают возможности бизнеса и коммунального сектора экономики, местной экономики противостоять коронавирусу и локдауну, тем мерам, которые были задействованы для того, чтобы противодействовать распространению болезни. И мы видим тут расхождение. Большая часть говорит, что необходима внешняя поддержка, но очень значительная часть также говорит и то, что этот малый бизнес, эти коммунальные предприятия имеют запас прочности и могут сами выстоять. И очень тревожный тоже один момент, что достаточно большое количество лидеров громад сказали, что у них вообще нет никакой местной экономики. И другой важный вопрос, как они оценивают все эти мероприятия, насколько они поддержат местный бизнес. И тут уже однозначный ответ, больше 75% считают, что эти меры недостаточны, и они не смогут поддержать бизнес. Следующий слайд, пожалуйста. Мы также спросили наших лидеров, какие функции они смогут точно выполнить и в условиях, когда эти меры были задействованы, а какие вызывают у них тревогу. И мы видим, что основные функции, там, благоустройство, вывоз мусора, они, конечно же, будут выполнять. Но уже то, что касается транспортировки больных или обеспечения медикаментами, вызывает сложности. И очень большую тревогу у лидеров громад вызывало, конечно же, это рост безработицы и банкротство местных предприятий. Мы также спросили о тех мероприятиях, которые были введены в других странах Европы, но не были в Украине, какие бы они поддержали. Наибольшую поддержку получили это беспроцентные кредиты для предприятий, у которых меньше 100 работников и которые потеряли, продажи которых уменьшились на 25% и больше. И также одноразовые гранты для малого бизнеса. Следующий слайд, пожалуйста. Мы тоже сделали открытый, конечно же, вопрос и дали возможность лидерам высказаться свою позицию о том, как воздействует коронавирус и мероприятия, которые задействовало правительство. И мы услышали приблизительно такие предложения или такие мысли, что, конечно, лучше не освобождать от налогов, а отложить. Очень важно передать органам местного самоуправления права на устанавливать индивидуальные льготы по налогам. И лучше, конечно же, перераспределить те налоги, которые получают одновременно, часть получает одновременно местное самоуправление и центральная власть в пользу местного самоуправления или найти любые другие возможности, но компенсировать органам местного самоуправления потери доходов, связанные с мероприятиями, которые вело правительство. И можно, следующий слайд, можно подвести некоторые итоги, очень коротко. Первый. Позиция органа местного самоуправления, местного самоврядування была очень конструктивной. Они понимали, что понесут какие-то убытки, понесут какие-то организационные проблемы, но были готовы бороться с коронавирусом. При этом 22% опрошенных высказались в таком плане, что меры, которые восприняло правительство, оно больше травмировало местное самоуправление, но меньше крупный бизнес в Украине. Следующий важный итог – это не было задействована правильная и понятная коммуникация между центральным уровнем управления и местной властью. Третий – это местные бюджеты понесли очень большие потери. 6% общих доходов от налогов в бюджеты, и их структура этих мероприятий, которые вело правительство, и подходы, в общем-то, не были восприняты. Возможно, потому что не было коммуникации нормальной, но они не были на локальном уровне восприняты и не рассматривались как такие, которые реально помогают местной экономике. И последний важный итог, что лидеры громад гарантировали, что они поддержат критическую инфраструктуру, смогут в основном бороться с негативными последствиями коронавируса, и очень бы хотели, чтобы право на решать, какие налоги, какая поддержка нужна местному бизнесу, все-таки принимались не на центральном уровне, а на местном. Спасибо за внимание, жду вопросов.
Благодарю вас, Анатолий. Тут какая-то заминка, я не могу свою камеру включить, но ладно, продолжим. Now let me introduce another speaker. Let me check. I think I cannot start my video somehow. Павла, вы можете, у вас, по-моему, или у вас, Анатолий, функция ко-хоста? Вы можете меня тоже ко-хостом сделать? Что-то у меня тут случилось.
Сейчас, извините. Я думаю, у меня нет.
Странно. Okay. So thank you very much, colleagues. We will leave the questions toward the end of the presentations. It was interesting presentation, a little bit long. So I remind kindly all the speakers that you have 15 minutes. So be in time. I would like to introduce my colleague, and right now already we know each other from this interesting endeavor with the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. Kate Thorpe, he was one of the experts who took part in the assessment of the decentralization and territorial policy review, and also he took part in the OECD implementation dialogue. He visited Kazakhstan. And Kate is actually working for the UK Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government based in London. And he is very experienced in supporting urban planning, covering housing, urban regeneration, and regional economic policies. So Kate, please, the floor is yours. I'm going to help you with switching the slides. So just let me know when you want to go to the next one.
I will, yes. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can hear you, but a little bit with a small disruption. I think.
Yes, I'm speaking through my headphones, but I can also try just speaking into the computer. I don't know if that will make it easier. I'll just try.
Okay.
Hello, can you hear me? Is that
Yes,
better?
Actually, it's the same, but go ahead.
Okay, I can't really do anything more. Yeah, I apologize. I was unable to get an internet connection on my personal laptop. So I'm using my office laptop, but I don't have all the Zoom facilities. We are not allowed to use Zoom on our office computer other than through our browser. So I don't get the interpretation facility, unfortunately, but I will, but at least you will have it. So I will speak now. Well, thank you for inviting me. I think the first point I want to make is the economic and social impact of COVID-19 has been greatest in the UK in its cities and largest towns. They account for over 60% of the country's economic output and well over half its population. So it's very much the cities that have borne the brunt of the pandemic. The challenge we now face is how to get central and local government to work together to rebuild the economies of our cities and towns. And these slides show some of the impact that COVID-19 has had on our cities. Some are detailed, but I will use them as a backdrop to what I have to say. And I'm very happy for copies of the presentation to be made available to people afterwards. Well, I put the first main slide up just to highlight a few general points. I think one of the important factors is the pandemic has very much exacerbated a lot of the economic and social inequality between places and people in the UK, particularly in our large cities where I think vulnerable groups were hit hardest by the pandemic. But also the most at-risk places tend to be those with high deprivation and a low ability to work from home. So most deprived areas of London and the southeast may not always be most at risk from outbreaks, but they will be hardest hit by a lot of the economic restrictions that have been introduced. But working from home has been a total revolution. It's driven changes in access to our cities, particularly the city centres, and footfall is unlikely to improve until workers return to work in the city centres. So London and the big cities have really been hit hardest by the pandemic. A key challenge is then, how do we get our city centres to recover? How do we get people to return to work in the cities? And that is a big challenge, particularly now that people have got used to working at home in many areas. A lot of the business-specific measures that government has brought in to help businesses have also been distributed through cities and local authorities. So there's been very much a partnership between central and local government, but it has highlighted the need for more multi-level governance approaches and very much a shared responsibility between the centre and local authorities. Next slide, please. I put up this slide because one of the challenges in the UK is the big spatial disparities that exist, particularly between the north and south of the country. We often call it the north-south divide, and this map shows levels of economic productivity by local enterprise partnership area. These are locally owned partnerships between central and local government that drive economic growth and job creation in the country. And you can see that the south and east of the country, southeast, particularly around London and the areas surrounding it, have the highest productivity levels. But some of the big cities have better productivity levels, but a lot of the country in the north and Midlands, productivity is well below the national average. So our government has a policy of trying to reduce these inequalities through what is called levelling up the underperforming areas and what we also call the left behind areas. Next slide, please. The pandemic has dramatically changed city life in the UK, as it has in many countries, with millions of office workers shifting to working at home and city centre footfall reducing dramatically. These maps and graphs are taken from Google mobility data, and they show that since 2020, March of 2020, when our first lockdown took place, that mobility is significantly lower in London and our biggest cities than in some of our smaller urban centres, which are in the second row of the graphs. Shoppers and workers have moved away from city centres to suburban areas where they live, following the government's stay-at-home message. So, and also only travelling for legally permitted reasons. So it's had a huge impact. Next slide, please. Well, this graph is taken from a Centre for Cities report. This is a think tank in the UK that specialises in city research and policy making, and it uses data from spending on non-essential items, so excluding food. But it shows that city centre spending by residents and non-residents, i.e. visitors like commuters, is lagging other kinds of urban spending. So the city centre spending has not recovered in the way that it has in some of the more suburban areas. And it's very much switched to local centres in the suburbs and away from the city centres. Next slide, please. This again shows footfall in UK city centres, and again reinforces the point I made that as the pandemic has progressed and the restrictions came and went, the smaller cities have seen more of a return to pre-pandemic levels than in London and the larger cities. So our biggest cities are still lagging the smaller places and the suburban areas compared to the city centres. And they will continue to struggle, the city centres, really until commuters return to their offices. Next slide, please. I included this slide really to show the impact of changes resulting from the pandemic will affect different places differently. Again, it underlines why more local governments is important, because places are not the same, and it also shows that the strongest city centres like London, although they've been the most severely affected by the pandemic, probably will rebound the fastest. And there will be more people working from home for some of the time, but I think the most successful city centre economies, because of the concentration of knowledge workers, will continue to be more resilient. So, and this has big implications for levelling up and tackling our north-south divide. Next slide, please. I won't go through this slide in detail, but it's really intended to show that there are two kinds of challenge that our cities face. I think the first is addressing what we call the cyclical response. That is supporting a revival of city centre economies and reversing the impact of the lockdown. And this could happen quite quickly. So it's very much a response to the removal of restrictions on people's movements. However, some of the changes in behaviour, like the need to commute, people shopping more online, less socialising at the moment, means that some of these changes may be permanent, and they will involve structural challenges that change the role potentially of a lot of city centres. So we have to think about how we address these issues. Of course, at the moment, we still don't know exactly what will happen when the restrictions are removed, but we have to be thinking about what the implications might be. Next slide, please. Well, the most impacted places in the short term, I think, will rebound more quickly, but the issue is, I think, that in the medium and longer term, it may well be that the places that have had a fast recovery may lead to a weaker city centre economy over the longer term as people move to more desirable peripheral areas and towns. So I think this is the big challenge. And again, we still don't know exactly what will happen, but there'll be a lot of potential adjustments. So the world will never be quite the same again. And we have to start thinking about what strategies we adopt, both at a local and a national government level, to address these challenges. Next slide, please. Well, this slide illustrates that whilst COVID-19 and the UK's exit from the European Union have exacerbated some of the challenges from UK cities, they're not totally new. So on the left, unemployment has risen during the coronavirus pandemic, particularly in London and the southeast, the most prosperous areas. But again, they are likely to bounce back more quickly because of their strong economic resilience. Sectors have also been affected, sectors of the economy, particularly aerospace, consumer goods, aviation, hospitality, tourism. All of these have suffered greatly. And then there's also the question of the weaker left behind places that were struggling even before the pandemic, particularly some of our coastal and northern areas. So it's going to require strong governance to coordinate the recovery. And some cities on the right-hand side have already developed recovery plans for their cities. Next slide, please. The future of our city centres may require a complete rethink. And I won't go into detail, but I think city centre living may become less attractive because of the ability to work from home. Current policies encourage more city centre housing. We may have to rethink those policies. Buildings that become vacant, we may have to repurpose them. And then it's a question of, well, what type of activity can occupy those buildings in the future? And then finally, rebuilding purpose-built buildings. Some of the shopping centres that may no longer be attractive to people to visit may have to find a new function. So these are big challenges. Next slide, please. I've included this slide to show the evolution of devolution and decentralization policy in England over the last 10 years or so, because since 2017, directly elected city region mayors, or metro mayors as we call them, have been introduced across England to lead what newly combined or created combined authorities. And these have been formed when two or more local authorities come together and agree a bespoke devolution deal with central government, permitting more powers to be devolved to the combined authority. I mean, some combined authorities may involve up to 10 local authorities covering a city region. And there are currently 8 city regions in England, plus, of course, Greater London, which has had an elected mayor since 2000. The Metro Mayor from West Yorkshire, which is immediately above the Liverpool and City Centre, and Sheffield city regions, will be elected in May when we have our local elections. But the Metro Mayors have had a very high profile during the COVID-19 pandemic, and they've been arguing for more powers and a seat at the table where decisions are made. So I think COVID-19 has increased the pressure for more devolution, and a pressure that the government is obviously taking very seriously. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is, I won't go into detail, but this is just illustrates some of the national fiscal interventions that government has introduced to mitigate the impact of COVID-19. There are people-specific measures which are mostly delivered by central government, and there's been a whole range of these measures to help retain jobs by furloughing people on 80% of their salary. So the government pays people 80% of their income not to work. But it's hoping that once the pandemic is over, they will be able to return to full employment. But that may or may not be the case in all businesses. Then there are business-specific measures, which are mostly channeled through local authorities, because they businesses pay a kind of local property tax called business rates. And the local authority has all of the contact information about these businesses. So they've been able to get grants to smaller businesses and medium-sized businesses very quickly. And then finally, there are the macroeconomic measures that are usually delivered by central government, like interest rate reductions, value-added tax, but also through banks providing loans to companies using money the government has provided. Next slide, please. City and local authority responses to COVID-19 have also been introduced to complement the central government measures. And this just illustrates some of the examples of the things that local authorities and cities have been doing. They play a very important role in communicating information on government restrictions during the lockdowns. We're now in our third lockdown since March of 2020, and also trying to raise awareness of the rules introduced, but also in the case of, for example, vulnerable groups, national government funds have been allocated to cities to help accommodate homeless people in hotels to try and get them off the streets. And they have been successful in reducing homelessness by more than 2/3. So again, local and central government have worked together on this. So the local authorities have played a very important role. Next slide, please. This is my final slide, and I just wanted to draw some lessons from the UK's experience. I think the first thing is to emphasize that the strong coordination between cities, local government, national government has been crucial in the fight against COVID-19 and in delivering funding schemes, particularly to smaller and medium-sized businesses. I think a second lesson, national government has rolled out an ambitious recovery package. I mean, it comes to more than our annual GDP, which is, you're talking about several, maybe 400 billion, 500 billion pounds. But it has seen government and local government working hand in hand to try and cushion the impact of the pandemic. And that has been one of the great, I think, achievements of the last year, in spite of the terrible challenges. Many UK cities have also developed and are developing their own post-pandemic recovery, renewal and investment strategies. And there are lots of these available on the internet, so you can see, but these are not only about supporting businesses and jobs, but trying to build more resilient, inclusive, sustainable economies in the future and powering new investment in green growth to build back better. Another lesson is the role of digitalization. I think in many ways it's accelerated trends perhaps by 10 years. Things that we might have been expecting to happen in 2030 are now happening in the early 2020s. So a lot of cities are now making more systematic use of smart city tools to deliver services. And it's been a huge game changer. And I'm sure this will be part of the new normal when we get out of the pandemic. Further point is on capability and capacity is absolutely crucial at the local level. And where there are constraints, these must be overcome if places are to rise to the challenge and be able to deliver devolved responsibilities. So it's not only about resources, but ensuring officials and elected representatives have the skills and expertise they need. And I guess the final point is really reiterating a point I made at the start, that the importance of place-based approaches and localized problem solutions are crucial. We need more devolution deals and the creation of more city regional authorities with elected mayors. And the government have pledged to introduce what we call a white paper, which will set out proposals for devolution and local growth, which we expect later in the year. So all of this is crucial to the levelling up agenda and building back better once the crisis is over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. Yeah, you're totally right. We will not live the same way as we did in the past. Yeah, and that's why we have an interesting presentation which follows yours. It's also from UK, but it's from our mentor, Judith Reiser. She's going to talk about new normal and how we have to think about new ways of planning and what kind of challenge we should consider. And she's a long-standing member of International Society of City and Regional Planners, where we met, and she's actually active writer and editor, and she's active promoter of place-based and participatory approach and engaging citizens in the process, and also She was one of the activists who proposed the Mayor Summit, which we had in the past as a part of the ISACARP events. So Judith, I also will help you with the presentation. So just let me know when I have to switch from one slide to the second one. The floor is yours, please. Judith, you can start.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
So I try to complementary to what my two predecessors have said and focus on pragmatism, and I'm afraid also on a little bit more pessimism than the others from my experience of COVID and lockdown and do experience it in central London. So basically, the next slide, please. The kind of panorama I would like to cover is to look at what are the trends which have been actually brought about by COVID. And I have then devised three very crude scenarios, which I come back on to. Next slide, please. In the early days, I did a very detailed analysis of what was happening day to day in those sectors. And I was deliberate to use those sectors because planning is very sectoral. It is not integrated, and it was looking into health separately, work separately, mobility separately, education, and so forth. And people, as usual, come last, although there is a lot of claim in the planning legislation and in the political arena, but basically people are just an add-on or a statistic. And so I would like to really keep that in mind. Next slide. So here are the three scenarios which I have envisaged. One was business as usual. And over the third lockdown now, I have a feeling, I was quite optimistic that it might be better than as usual, but I'm sorry to say that the signs are and the trends are that if it's business as usual, it might be actually worse. And the second scenario is a sort of the other side of the spectrum, is very idealistic, is about really realizing sustainability, dealing with climate change properly, having an integrated approach to more resilience to future pandemics, to climate change, and to less inequality, social inequality. And the third scenario is a sort of pragmatic scenario, which I thought, what are actually things that might be doable and build on the positive changes which have occurred during our experience with COVID, because not everything was negative. For example, in the very early stages, people were extremely helpful to each other. There was a new kind of cohesion, social contribution to each other. I have experienced it personally as well, which was really very encouraging. But unfortunately, there is lockdown fatigue, especially by the young. And so these type of changes of behavior don't seem to be very long-term. Next slide, please. So I am looking at these three scenarios in relation to two aspects, the built fabric and mobility. So in relation to the built fabric, and everybody has mentioned that, of course, it's the continuing home working. How much of that will actually take place? How much do people want to actually go back to offices because of their social relations? Because we are humans, so we need each other, we need interaction, we need inspiration from each other and stuff like that. So this is an open question and obviously very important for the planning of the future of built environment, as Keith and also and the previous speaker have referred to. And of course, there is the suburbanization, the people moving out there, etc. But I think it's a bit simplistic to just say this is the only way that things have changed, because in the UK, for example, we are very much our housing market is very much linked to a change of mortgages because people haven't got the money to buy the houses, so they have to borrow the money for it over life. And so anyway, they cannot actually buy a house in the suburbs and keeping their flat in central cities. So they have to actually sell that in order to be able to buy another premise. And henceforth, it means that somebody else is actually taking over these premises, and that needs to study much more detailed study, in my view, much more differentiated than at the moment. Just say everybody moves to the suburbs to a house with a garden and will go on working for home, which I don't think is 100% true. Of course, some of it, but how much and so on. This is very open to debate and to observation and research. Then, of course, there is also the question about the new centralities. Again, Keith has referred to the empty city centre, and London is particularly affected by that, but also it's a world city, so it had a loss of other things, especially its cultural dimensions, its uniqueness in terms of theatres, exhibitions and stuff like that, shopping for luxury, tourists and so on. So it is a very special case in relation to other city centres, I think. And obviously the positive side of that is that the high streets and the town centres in the suburbs and so on, which have been declining for a long time, they see a sort of a new revival, because people, if they do not move to the city centre, if they don't commute, they obviously are using these services more. So there is a great opportunity of redesigning, reworking these declining city centres. Also, it would need a different approach to a more multiple types of uses rather than just a shopping mall and stuff like that. So it also would impact on legislation, either local authority regulations and or planning legislations like use classes and stuff like that. So there is an open system there at work, which really would need rethinking. And there is a bill in Parliament at the moment on yet again reducing planning and the planning role, and maybe that needs rethinking seriously in the light of the impacts of COVID. And that might create new centrality. So the whole urban fabric may have different, may become multipolar, multi-nodal, more than at the moment when you just have one large city center, which is absorbing most of the leisure and shopping and so forth activities. So there are very big changes in the making. And if we have to live with COVID rather than get rid of it, and there are signs that it will be like flu, so it will be among us, not as intensely as now, but anyways, we have the vaccine, so we will be able to cope with it better. But there might be other coronaviruses in approaching us. So the cities have to think about the resilience against future pandemics, or this pandemic mutating and stuff like that. And that means that the social distancing may also have to stay in some form or other. And that is a real issue for densely built cities and city centers, because I mean, to change the urban fabric to accommodate that is more than a challenge. Can I have the next slide, please? The next one. So, sorry, no, can you go back? I'm sorry, I didn't see. Sorry. So it will be there also more online shopping. This has obviously increased a lot, but the trend had already existed before COVID. So we have to see what the division of online shopping and its distribution is going to be, because it also has an impact on mobility in cities. For example, if you have to actually distribute single parcels to single households rather than people going to shops and buy several things and take them home by themselves. So these will have a great impact on how the streets are being used, and of course also on pollution from traffic. And the same is about the education system, which when the schools were closed and so on, learning has gone online. It has worked more or less well. So the question really is it going to stay there, or how much is going to stay there, and how much will actually go back to face-to-face learning and education? So these are still open questions which have great impacts, again, on the urban fabric. For example, in London, we have a lot of internationally reputed universities, but we certainly don't have enough accommodation for students. We don't have campuses. We don't have these kind of things. So maybe the universities might be quite happy to have some of the online teaching going on beyond the COVID threat. And it depends how much the high fee-paying students are actually wanting to comply with online teaching or wanting to have a student life in cities. So these are very important open questions, and they all impact on planning. The next slide, please. So I'm going to mobility, which I've already mentioned in relation to the online shopping as opposed to in-shop shopping. So there also has been an increase in cycling and walking during the COVID, which was supported by central and local government. But there is a lot of resistance to that. And I think the social economic resistance is increasing. People want to go back to what they're used to having and doing. And so, for example, London has laid on temporary cycling lanes, and they have been used, but in certain places like in Kensington, Chelsea, they have been absolutely abolished again because the transportation car lobby has been very strong and has said, we don't want that. So these things are not acquired for the longer term. They may have worked during the short term. For example, there was also the pavements were made available for restaurants and so on to sprawl out so that there would be less contagion of COVID indoors. Whether that is going to stay longer term, and whether space of the public realm, our streets, is going to be attributed differently between the private motor car, the cyclists, the pedestrians, and commerce, is also a very open question. And okay, we say you have more private electric cars, but basically, where does all that electricity come from, this extra demand, if everybody has a private car and drives around single occupied electric cars? So I don't think that is a solution either. And the post-COVID planning would be a great opportunity to say, how can we actually approach the personal mobility in a different way, try to shift more people to collective transport, to walking, to cycling, and maybe also to car sharing and different models which exist, but which are not very used at the moment. And of course, all that means a lot of political will. And again, I am not personally convinced that it is actually there in central government and in local government. And the same goes for aviation. Of course, the airport and their airline lobby is extremely strong and has been always subsidized. For example, the kerosene is not paying any tax and stuff like that. So it's a very subsidized industry at the best of time. And these subsidies, there is no question that they're going to be actually eased up. So I am sorry that I'm not terribly optimistic for a better, more green future. And planning is also emaciated a lot. So one sees what can actually happen. Next slide, please. So in lieu of conclusions, because I think the situation is extremely fluid and changing all the time, so I don't think we can draw conclusions at the moment yet, but we can look at certain trends and certain desirable futures and certain realistic trends which are already showing. For example, there are studies made about the reduction of air pollution due to traffic. Air pollution has gone down quite a lot at the beginning of COVID, but it is back to what it was before, with a different composition between the NOxes and CO2 and so forth. But still, it is back to normal. And again, the slower living pace which we had due to furloughing and stuff like that seems to translate rather into formal unemployment once all these subsidies are stopped, which they have to be sooner or later anyway. And the social greater cohesion, which was very, very tangible at the very beginning. Also the sympathy with the NHS and the workers, the key workers and stuff like that. That has also waned a lot. And I'm sorry to say that it is much more, people have gone more selfish and more retrenched among themselves, on their families, rather than friends and so forth. So competition between also the sectoral interests seems to be harsher, because each sector says we want to have lockdown eased on us first, etc., etc. The same goes for vaccination. They say, well, it shouldn't be the elders, it should be us, it should be the transport workers, etc., etc. So everybody wants a piece of the action, and so that is very much back to the human habits of before. Next slide. So again, I want to say that at the moment, there doesn't seem to be a lot of political will for a real alternative, a real more sustainable, more humane, less divisive, less polarized social and economic future. But there are a possibility of, that is the kind of macro level of which I'm talking. But at a smaller scale, there are really possible interventions. Of course, there are a lot of examples already of community actions and stuff like that, also before COVID, but on which can be built. But it depends how much energy these community activists have, and how much opportunities they will be given to actually intervene and make a positive contribution, but of course self-organized and with also their own thinking about what they want, so that some say in the decision-making process, which is not very forthcoming. And the other thing is that maybe small cities and medium-sized cities have a better chance to recover from COVID and to change. That might be true, but we shouldn't forget what is very strong in the UK, the NIMBYism. People don't want other people coming where they are in the suburbs and in the small cities and in the low density areas. So there again, there are issues which we have to really look into very seriously. Next slide, please. You can see that of course the cities would have to adjust to either a post or with COVID resilience in the future. But cities are the built environment has a lot of inertia, so it's extremely difficult to change densities, to change road space and so forth. So it is not really realistic to say that we can adapt the cities to what would be ideally needed in order to have a safer, pandemic-safe future built environment. And the same goes that we have other challenges to the social and economic future, like artificial intelligence use and so forth. And these trends are going on. Maybe they're even accelerated, like Keith has mentioned, in certain sectors. And I think that is also something which has to be really looked at very, very seriously. And so that a better new normal, which was very desirable and which people subscribed to earlier on, I don't think this will not come about on its own. It would need a lot of political and social will to make it happen. Next slide, please. So my last comments are about the intervention by planning. In my experience, planning has its own idiosyncrasies, and two of them are that there is this conventional wisdom, so that there is always a monorail, there is one solution and one only, to the exclusion of all else. So we go and say, okay, people want houses with gardens, so let's give them that, as an example. The other thing is also say that it's one size fits all, that there is this one solution and it will be an absolute solution for absolutely all the conditions in all places. That is certainly not the case. We are talking about place-based evolution and changes, yes, indeed, but I don't think this is happening very much at the moment yet. And we have to also know that there are a lot of contradictions. There are so many different interests in our societies, and they are real. So somebody has to arbiter, either the central government with the help of the planners as contributors to rebalancing the relationship between these sectoral interests. So there is a big issue, a big task for planning and of course decision-making, political decision-making. And it is very important to, while we're dealing with these realities, to seek out and examine the development of sustainable, resilient alternatives. Again, there are lots of ideas floating about and lots of people experimenting with that, with a cyclical economy, the circular economy, the renewable economy, and all these kind of things. So the ideas are not lacking, but it's a matter of how to translate them into practical measures and policies. And so what is also needed is much greater integration and cooperation between the various levels of government. And of course, we all have our own subjective perspective on what is happening. And there I'm not as idealistic as Keith's presentation that the cooperation between central government, local government is working very well. I don't think this is the case. And it's also based on political divides. One example, the Tory government is trying to punish the Labour mayor of London by not giving the proper support for the public transportation to recover properly. And public transportation nowhere in the world can live like a commercial enterprise. It needs some kind of public contribution, public subsidy, and so forth. So, I mean, that's just one example. So these things are still very difficult issues which need working on. Next, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judith. It was very interesting, I think, ideas for discussion, and we heard a lot of interesting presentations and ideas. And I think we all agreed with the need to research and really reinforce the evidence for decision making. And I'm happy that our Ukrainian colleagues, they're trying to find their own way to decentralize, and they're constantly trying to collect some data from the field and understand what's happening. I think we have one question for the attendee. Let me allow him to ask. So, okay. So first, okay, I will allow him to ask if he wants, but I don't know. So, Kanat, you can ask your question if you have. Okay. While we're waiting, I have a question. I actually to all the speakers, and it's up to you who is going to answer. I really like interesting finding about miscommunication or lack of communication during the pandemic. I think this was one of the main issue of all the social protests going on around the world. When there is a lack of communication between the government and the people, we actually, of course, meet the mistrust, yeah. And the people start to think on their own and try to develop their own survival strategies, yeah, that may not be good for the government, because the government just want to have everything in peace in this kind of pandemic time. Maybe I will just ask Ukrainian colleagues start, and then maybe Kate and Judith will add. So what do you think, what kind of policy solutions, or what can be done in the future in your Ukrainian context or in the UK context to improve actually communication between the government and the people in order during this kind of pandemic times we feel comfortable and we feel part of this kind of development rather than be a kind of victims of what's happening, yeah? Any ideas, maybe Anatoly or Pavlo?
Если можно, я начну, Медина. Спасибо большое за вопрос. Это действительно то, что у нас в Украине. Павел говорил, что Украина в очень сложном положении оказалась, потому что не только мы под влиянием пандемии, но и очень такой кардинальной реформы, децентрализации и новой конфигурации местной власти. И, конечно же, в 2020 году происходили выборы на местном уровне, они впервые в Украине были на партийной основе. Это очень тоже усложнило ситуацию. И хочу еще раз подчеркнуть, что некоторые местные лидеры территориальных громад прямо поддержали протесты против локдаунов и других мер, необходимых по коронавирусу, и отрицали его влияние и так далее, и так далее. Что, конечно же, очень усложняло реализацию результативной политики на всех уровнях, на центральном и на локальном, которая помогла бы победить негативные последствия коронавируса более успешно. И, конечно же, меня очень заинтересовали и подходы, и слова Thorpe о том, что в Британии была лучшая коммуникация, и были такие площадки, которые разрешали высказывать мнение, понимать один от другого. В Украине пока этого не было. Я думаю, что основные причины — это становление нового местного самоуправления, новые подходы, вызванные децентрализацией. И нам очень нужно, опять же, то же, что говорил господин Кейт, что очень нужны новые возможности цифровой экономики, новые возможности цифровой коммуникации, в том числе и для того, чтобы обеспечить взаимодействие не только между центральным уровнем управления, но и местным уровнем управления. И, конечно же, между населением и администрацией. Как раз в этой сфере сейчас и работает очень активно Павел, как эксперт Мирового банка. Может, он несколько слов добавит к моим словам?
Ну, я что хотел добавить, что то, что не успел еще сказать, но это одна ремарка. В связи с тем, что у нас децентрализация произошла, у нас еще переформатируется еще в процессе переформатирования система здравоохранения местных уровней. Вот. У нас государство должно передать часть первичной медицины местным общинам, и у них было бы больше полномочий реагировать на вызовы, в том числе и по пандемии. Но это еще не произошло, и можно, конечно, коммуникация, она всегда важна, но я поддержу Анатолия, что у нас не было таких площадок, и плюс все-таки нужна еще и эффективность высокая эффективность тех чиновников государственных, которые принимают решения. Увы, мы сейчас видим с той стороны, что какие-то решения неэффективны. Ну и нужно об этом тоже говорить. Мы говорим, и я хотел сказать сейчас тоже. Спасибо.
Спасибо. Thank you. Now I hope that Kate and Judith will a little bit reflect. So Kate, I think the communication issue was one of the big deal, but I like that Pavlo mentioned also that we need a new type of decision makers, because how we can expect a change in our living environment if we are going to repeat the same behavior, yeah? And the behavior starts from our decision makers. So I think Kate is working in one of the our desired department, promoting the local growth and the community development. And you said that there is a new way for devolution. So how do you think how you can help the local governments to work with people and how to increase this trust by means of communication? So what kind of lessons you have learned from after this COVID in terms of communication between the local government and the citizens?
I think certainly there was a lot of over-optimism at the start. I mean, the government probably should have introduced a lockdown earlier than it did. And I think this was also combined with a lack of preparedness for what was expected. I think even the scientists were not necessarily geared up to recognize the potential impact of the pandemic. One of our scientists said, oh, 20,000 deaths would be a good outcome. Well, we've had over 130,000 deaths in the UK already because of COVID. In fact, the final figure will be probably much higher. COVID may have been a contributory factor to some deaths, but I think to try and create more confidence and communicate better with communities, I think a lot is recognizing that COVID isn't something that will go away quickly. It may well be that through the vaccination program, I mean, over 25 million people have been vaccinated or had one vaccination already. I've had mine about a month ago. But I think it's the need to be realistic and truthful to people. And I think government at the start, I think we're giving the impression we're all going to be over within a matter of 3 or 4 months. And I think that there will be a need, I think, probably to set up a permanent unit to cope with future pandemics. One reason why South Korea and Vietnam, I think, have had the pandemic has been less of an issue there is because of the experience they had with SARS, the SARS vector that affected a lot of Southeast Asian countries and parts of China. And they, in response, realized that when COVID-19 came along, they already had units that could deal with this, particularly through testing. But I think government hasn't necessarily communicated things as well as it might have done. So I would agree, we do need to improve communication, and that does mean working much more closely with local authorities. They have played an important role in getting the message across to their local populations, and complementing what central government is doing. But there's been a lot of tension between our big city region mayors and the government in that to begin with, it wasn't really listening to them. I mean, some people would still argue that it's not listening to them in the way it should. So I think there needs to be much more of a dialogue between the centre, and both sides need to get together to try and find a way of doing things better and differently in the future. It is making better use of social media, because there's also been a lot of misinformation on social media, which perhaps hasn't always been prioritized in the way it should have been. I think there's now responsibility on the part of Google and Facebook to ensure that they're not allowing misinformation to be widely generated. So you face a lot of challenges, but I think a lot of lessons have been learned, and I think dealing with COVID now will become much more of, if there's ever a future pandemic, it will now be seen as a priority, whereas it wasn't before. I think Bill Gates had anticipated a couple of years ago in a speech that there might well be something like this, and the world wasn't listening. I think now that we have this experience, it will change things. So I'm optimistic that there will be a better response, or at least I hope there will be. But then I'm a civil servant. I suppose I'm having to be positive about this. But I think I think there's lots of lessons and there will be a review. I know the government have said, it's too early to do a proper review of lessons learned from the pandemic, but I think they need to be held to holding some kind of review, because if government doesn't, somebody else will. And it may well be that it's far better to be on the front foot.
I wish UK has more civil servants like UK who are not only making decisions, but also good policy analysts, understanding the long-term outcomes. That, of course, nobody says it's easy to do this, but we must understand that we are actually trying to put the seed for the long-term future.
Yeah.
So nothing is easy if we want to change it toward the better. It's good that you and your department, if it's small, I wish you to grow, thinking in this way and supporting the local communities and the elected mayors who are trying to do something good. And I would like to listen, Judith. We have two questions in the chat area, but before I give a floor to answer, Judith, so as a citizen of London, so you also mentioned that there are some active groups promoting some good change, and also they actually developed their own version of the London development plan. So there are actually some tendencies of the place-based movement. But how do you think what can be done from this kind of advocacy groups together with the government, because we are now together against the pandemic? So the people, local and national government, we will have to work together to build a new future. So what are your ideas about the role of planners and the role of active groups?
Yes, well, first I would like to answer the issue about communication, because it's interdependent and it's extremely important. Because when you talk about communication, it's not communication. It's being talked at from the top down on the whole. The government tells you what to do, how to be, and all that sort of stuff, and tells the local government, and the local government tells the people. So I don't think this is a very good way of going forward. And it's very antagonistic very often, unfortunately. It's divided in many ways. It was divided between right wing and left wing politics. Now it is divided between identity politics, all sorts of stuff like that. I mean, these things are changing, but the principle of the one who has the power is going to tell the other one what to do and how to do it. This is the same. So there is devolution, yes, from the central government to local government to various levels of responsibilities usually, and tasks, new tasks, everything, but not the resources, not the skills, not anything, and especially not the decision-making power. And that is the key. And the same goes again from the local authority down to the communities which are rebelling against planning decisions, whatever it is, and so forth. I mean, you know, who want to do their own things from the bottom up. I absolutely agree that it cannot be either bottom up or top down. I have been working on this issue for decades. So this is really my baby, if you like. And I have also been working in London and in other places, in other countries, with local community activists and how they are going about trying to improve their local conditions, even in a very, very small scale, including in informal settlements, including a lot by women, by the way, and so forth. So this, for example, in London, there is a group, an association of community action groups, which is called Just Space, and they have done an awful lot from the bottom up, and they also communicate. They are actually cooperating, or at least in dialogue, for example, with the local authority at two levels, including at the London-wide level, where we have our elected mayor, as Keith has mentioned. So they have made two contributions to the London plan. The first one in 2016, they actually wrote a people's London plan. So they took exactly the format of the official London plan, said, how does it look from the actual people who are at the receiving end of this plan? A very interesting document, very worth looking up on the Just Space website. It's still there. The same has happened in the plan, which has now just finally been adopted, again, because there is so much controversy between the Tory party in power and the mayor in London. So that's obscuring all the other things which are so much more important. So coming back onto, and that's why I think what needs evolving is also two things: A, decision-making powers; B, trust; C, resources, including money. So for me, for example, the participation is just seen from the top down as this is free labor, free information, free knowledge. As long as they can give it to us, and then we'll make with it what we like. I mean, I'm putting a very black and white picture here deliberately to actually bring these things to the fore. So what my view is, a lot of developers, they sit in the wings and wait until the land value is improving, where the local activists have actually intervened and improved the local conditions, the local environment, sometimes public realm, sometimes buildings, whatever it is. And then when it is ripe, they come and take all the value added, which has been contributed through the activists, the contributors from the bottom up, the local communities, all into their own pockets, sometimes shared with the government, i.e. with local government, but certainly not with those who have created this added value. So in my view, the next time they revise the planning legislation and participation, it was to have a clause to say some just and equitable reward of this value added, which these people are creating over years sometimes, being after that displaced and ousted because they themselves can't live and work anymore in those areas which are now too expensive for them. They should have some part of that reward, material reward. And during their actions, why should there be the local authority employees being paid and not the local activists? I mean, this is something very important, and money talks. So if that is changed, I am sure that the relationship and the communications and the cooperation between those levels will change fundamentally. That is my very simple message, what needs changing.
Thank you very much. I actually want to build up on your remark about when we delegate or decentralize responsibilities, we should not forget about that to take over these responsibilities, you need some resources. Yeah. And we have in the chat area actually a relevant question. And I don't know, Kate, if you said that you're going to be in a hurry, so let me first give your floor and then maybe our Ukrainian colleagues, because they have two questions and you have only one. So the participants want to know some key lessons learned after the pandemic, that actually how you're going to be more effective in supporting the private sector to respond to future crises. And I know that you're doing a lot to improve the local business environment. So maybe you will provide some examples or your own analytical point of view.
Yes, I think certainly there's a recognition that trying to capture the value of land that goes up simply because developers land bank, it's something that government is very concerned about. I mean, certainly the trouble is it's been an issue that's been debated for a long time, and developers often do have to pay a contribution towards community infrastructure, for example, when they get permission to develop. We have a planning system that requires, at least at the moment, for people to apply for permission and then to, as a condition of planning permission, to build perhaps or provide funds for community benefits. So it might include providing not just roads, but it might involve providing community facilities like schools and so on. So this is a process of negotiation, but I think more could be done. And one of the issues is our Treasury haven't really allowed some of these land value capture proposals to come in. It's an issue that's been debated a lot, not only in this country, but in America as well and other places. And I think there are already lots of examples of where things are successful, but we are faced with, as I say, a number of constraints, but there's recognition that this is something that needs to be addressed. And there isn't, I think also this, the idea of public or private sector philanthropy, probably not as strong in the UK as it is in some countries like America. And I think government could do a lot more to incentivize private sector philanthropy, particularly to help develop infrastructure, for example. So it's an issue that is already, there's a recognition of it. But I think there's still a way to go, and government have perhaps not been as bold as they should be in terms of capturing the value from development or prospective developments, and then making sure that people in the community benefit from that. So it's an ongoing issue. Hello.
Thank you. We have two questions for Pavla and Anatoly. from Ilyas. He's interested about the assumption we usually have when we delegate or power to the local levels. We assume that if we provide them with the land and with the other assets, ultimately they will become better in decision making and they will their capacity increase. So I think Ilyas wants to know from the experience of Ukraine, how do you think the management of assets improved since the decentralization? Could you maybe share some results of your studies or your observations? If it's changing or if it's getting worse, because I know that corruption level in Ukraine is also one of the high among the post-Soviet countries.
Да, есть не без этого, но мы как бы над этим работаем. И на самом деле, ну, во-первых, передача полномочий и активов, и в меньшей мере финансовая децентрализация, она как бы способствует тому, что управление активами улучшается. Ну, как бы на примере поясню, что когда у тебя там сеть, ну, или количество объектов, которые управляются госорганом или структурой, там, десятки тысяч, и когда оно, как бы, эта ну, структура децентрализируется на территориальные громады, общины, то в общине, ну, как бы, местное самоуправление уже там получает на своей территории там 10-20 объектов. Конечно, ну, как бы управление улучшается, и каждая община считает, что ей целесообразно как бы содержать, что нет, что хотят люди, и к, ну, как бы представителям, к главе, к там, депутатам, к исполнительному совету как бы достучаться проще, чем там к какому-то условному чиновнику даже в районе или там в области, или уже говорю про государственный уровень. И у нас как бы проблема в том, что коррупция большая, она как бы на этих уровнях тоже, ну, имеет место, а вот на местном уровне этого меньше или там, ну, меньше объемы и так далее. Поэтому это как бы децентрализация, в том числе, как бы в том числе активов, ну, а активы идут вслед за полномочиями. Ну, в Украине это как бы панацея, наверное, тоже, и это и как бы коррупции. И, ну, еще как бы проблема в том, что мы получили большое наследство от Советского Союза по местам на предоставление публичных услуг. Это там развитые сети библиотек, народных домов или там клубов, там школ. И оно фактически государством до сих пор как-то там на копейки содержалось. Когда это все передается в местное самоуправление, они уже считают, нужно, не нужно. Может быть, один большой центр там, предоставления культурных услуг организовать на всю общину, нежели там, содержать условно 10 там, ну, каких-то зданий и так далее. Вот на таком примере. И вот мы это видим, это помогаем тоже как бы трансформировать. Если, вот, отвечая на этот вопрос.
Спасибо, thank you.
Анатолий еще, наверное, хотел добавить.
Очень интересный вопрос, и, конечно же, он качества реформы касается. Украина прошла очень интересный, своеобразный путь децентрализации и административной реформы, о которой можно говорить очень долго, но и я считаю его успешным. Но я считаю также, что это только этап, который уже вынуждает задумываться о следующем этапе, потому что хочется всегда больших результатов, и больших результатов в виде того, о чем спрашивают нас, в виде управления, качественного управления землей, качественного управления территорией, городской средой, качественного управления услугами. Этого мы не можем сказать, что удалось достичь уже прямо на сегодня. И одна из причин, и такой урок Украины, это качество администрирования. У нас, как говорил уже Павел, по ходу происходит реформа и земельная, и налоговая, и медицинская, многие другие. И в этой ситуации очень важный урок – это подготовить до того, как мы запускаем, или параллельно очень качественных администраторов. Нужны школы, буквально школы тех людей, которые будут руководить уже в новых условиях и новыми территориальными единицами, потому что это совсем не тот опыт, который был предыдущий. И у нас минус, когда главой совета стает представитель старой чиновнической школы, и минус также, когда стает неподготовленный, честный, но это не профессия, но неподготовленный человек. Вот это вот такая проблема. Спасибо.
Thank you, Anatoly and Paula. Very interesting. I think today's session showed that this trend of decentralization is going on around the world, and I'm happy that we're slowly moving to understanding that sometimes it's good to use the local resources locally, and the people can be more responsible to the resources they have and make some rational decision making. And we're really happy that we all agree that we need new kind of decision makers, because if we talk about the new normal, we cannot have old approach to development, old approach to thinking about the people. And we have one question on Facebook about, to conclude, what we can see, we just talked about a new challenge that we had in the past, which is digitalization. So before COVID, we're all afraid of the new area of IT, technologies, and digitalization. And people were afraid of that this high speed of new technology will take our jobs. But now, because of COVID, now we all thinking, or we are all see the benefits of having information and technologies and digital platforms. And I know that London is one of the pioneer opening the database and opening the sources for the people, and they're trying to open the statistical data for researchers. And we also try, and I see also Ukraine and some of the active groups trying to do some analytical reports available on the different regional development in Ukraine. So now we see that digitalization is not bad. So it can actually help us to survive in this new normal. So if you want, any of you can comment on how do you see this digitalization coinciding with the new pandemic situation, where we can win and where we can be it can be dangerous, where we should be aware of it, because we did not talk about inequality, which is one of the big issue. Some of my participants cannot join because they didn't have access to the internet. Yeah. So when we talk about the technologies, and we also have to talk about if all people can get access to enjoy these technologies. So I don't know, Kate or Judith or some colleagues from Ukraine who wants to ask, just say some concluding remarks about how to live in new normal using the technologies and how to make it really accessible to all, because we have this issue of accessibility.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think certainly digitalization has it's been a marvelous thing in allowing activity, not least people like myself, to work from home and still do my job. So in that sense, I think it's brought a lot of benefits for schools where children have access to a laptop computer. They've been able to learn remotely. The problem is that there is a digital divide, that a lot of children were not able to access online lessons because they don't have a computer. They're unable to afford one. There's been a lot of movement. The government has provided some money, but also there's been a lot of work done by through fundraising to buy laptop computers for children who don't have access to them. So I think this recognition that everybody should have access to the internet is now, I think, quite crucial. And government has helped, but it hasn't done possibly as much as it might have done. So a lot of even newspapers have been setting up funds to encourage readers to contribute to this funds to allow more people that don't have access to IT. So I think it is a divide still, and that's something that has to be addressed, and there has to be a public policy, I think, to cover that. But the thing is, remote learning is still not a substitute for face-to-face contact, and I think there will be more remote learning now in the future than there has been perhaps in the past. So it means that where you have the facilities, you can still learn without necessarily having to travel, but it shouldn't be at the expense of travel. It would be a terrible thing if all our universities and schools simply went for remote learning without the face-to-face contact, because we are, at the end of the day, social animals, and we need that sort of thing. But I think the whole the other issue is, of course, access to high quality internet, not just in terms of computers, but also the Wi-Fi. And many parts of our country, particularly rural areas, don't necessarily have very good Wi-Fi. Even where I live in central London, I cannot use my mobile phone indoors because I can't get a signal. And I'm only 6 miles from the centre of London. So there are big issues there about improving connectivity. And that's something that I think there's awareness of. Government is now putting more money into this and helping private companies to ensure that there aren't what we call not spots where people don't have access to it. But it isn't only about technology, it is also about improving access to the different forms of Wi-Fi. So these are all things that I think there will be a lot bigger emphasis on this in the future.
Thank you very much. I think Judith she has something to add, and then we will conclude, because I see that time passed so fast. It was an interesting conversation. Please, Judith, please, if you want to conclude.
Yes, I very much support what Keith has been saying. Where I dissent is about the philanthropy, private philanthropy. I think digital access to digital, and he's right to talk about the infrastructure and the provider. It's not just about the computer at the end of the line, and going and whipping around and get some money to buy a few computers for a few pupils. That is sticking plaster. That is, and it shouldn't be left to just the goodwill of the ones or the others. I think this is a public common right, like access to electricity, access to energy, access to water. It's a fundamental right of the 21st century, everywhere in the world, including here in the so-called developed world. So it is a public duty to supply and provide the access, the infrastructure, whatever is necessary, and to make it affordable as well. I mean, the ITU has been very pioneering in this for many, many, many decades. I've been working for them, so I know a little bit about it. And they have really advanced this idea very much so. And I think what is needed there is not just to get public participation by individuals or community groups and so on, but also by the business world, because business doesn't just consist of the 5 biggies in Silicon Valley. There is a lot of business really the small businesses are making up the bulk of all that. And actually, I think in this better dialogue, better communication, better cooperation rather than confrontational situation all the time is to involve the businesses as well, because they can make also contributions, not just by donating a bit of money here and there or a few objects, but by actually helping with their knowledge, with their situation, so on, to improve and to provide this type of infrastructure, which is not sufficient at the moment, including in developed countries like ours, and not just in rural areas. I quite agree. I live in central London as well. I don't get the signal all the time. I have to fight all the time, even to be on the webinar now. It's just marginal. So there is a lot to be done on that one. But I think we have to be inclusive and to actually build on the human resources, the human will. There is a lot of that about, and it has shown so much at the beginning of the COVID. And I think it's still there somewhere. And I feel that this would be a good idea to try to harness this goodwill about, that we are in it together, and so that everybody can make a certain contribution. But it means respect, it means trust for all these people into them, and it needs some devolution of decision making. They see and do things differently. So what? That might be actually enriching rather than in the way of how the center sees the future. So I'm very much in favor of opening up and being in it together.
Thank you very much, Judith. The last minute I would like to use to invite all of you and participants to the tomorrow's session, which is a part of our seminar, moderated by Ilyas Yazdavletov, my colleague. He's doing his PhD at the University of Edinburgh. And we gathered representatives of the Almaty city government and Bishkek city government. And also there will be some activists and consultants, and also Dr. Georgi, who is actually leading an interesting network of city governments, which is called Municipal Level Dialogue in Times of COVID-19. So he will talk a little bit about how they are, what kind of research they're doing, measuring impact of COVID on municipal level in different countries, and what kind of findings they have, and it will be interesting. So please do join us tomorrow. And today I think we had a very interesting discussion within these 2 hours. We covered important topics, and we see that COVID must not lead to centralization, which a lot of people worry about, but it actually must force us to decentralize in a better way, having a different indicators, having different values in mind. Yeah, one of the values to allocate equality. So we have to think about this appeared inequality, that not all people can afford isolation or sometimes get access to internet to get public good as education. So we have a new indicators for decentralization, and it can be key message that if we want to do something for the local communities and cities, we have to reestablish our development goals, development objectives, and a little bit differently approach planning of cities and regions. So thank you very much for your participation. It was a great honor to have all of you on board, because you're all doing a lot by involving in research and policy analysis to change this. I wish you great health, to be strong on your objective. Don't leave it. It's very important, because on the 21st century, we will see that the young generation is more demanding. They are not, they're less, less control, cannot be controlled. They want to be heard, and they want to get, really honest and equal distribution of resources. And that's why we have to reflect it and change. We have to change ourselves and change our decision makers who are filling the government on the different levels. So thank you very much. This is recorded, and you can watch it on Facebook and YouTube. I will send you the links. So if some of your colleagues could not join, you can send them the video record and they can enjoy our session. Thank you and have a nice day for all from the UK and that part of the world, and good evening to all of our colleagues from Central Asia and Ukraine. Bye-bye.
Bye.
До завтра. До свидания.